My name is Jessica. I always thought I lived in a safe world where the worst thing that could happen was a broken nail plate or a missed bus. My story began when I moved to the small town of Brockton. The town seemed like the perfect place to start a new life. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, perfect homes. But I had no idea that something terrible was hiding behind this idol. It was the day I moved into my new house, an old two-story cottage, cozy and furnished with antique furniture. It looks like an ideal place for a quiet life. The first suspicious thing was that the neighbors avoided direct contact with me. They greeted each other politely, but quickly looked away and hurried on their way. I chalked it up to their shyness and didn't pay much attention, but at night, everything changed. I woke up to a strange sound, similar to the grinding of metal. It was coming from the basement. I broke out in a cold sweat, but I decided it was just my imagination and went back to bed. The next night, the sound came again, but this time it was clearer and much closer. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Taking a knife for self-defense from the kitchen, I slowly went down the stairs. The light in the basement wasn't working, so I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The screeching continued, but now it was accompanied by a soft whisper. I opened the basement door and saw something that made my hair stand on end. In the corner, tied to a chair, sat a girl. She looked exhausted and beaten, her clothes covered in blood. She raised her eyes at me, full of fear and pain. I realized that this was not an accident, it was planned, and I was now involved in this horror. It was just the beginning. Little did I know that Brockton was home to a serial killer, and now I was his next target. I stood there, paralyzed with terror, unable to believe my eyes. The girl was looking at me, her lips were moving, but no sound reached my ears. I slowly came closer, trying not to make too much noise. Her voice was weak, barely audible. "Help," she whispered. I quickly looked around for any tool or means that could help her free herself. Suddenly, I heard footsteps upstairs. My heart beat faster. I realized that the killer was coming back. There was no time to think. "You should be quiet," I whispered, pulling a knife from my belt. "I'll come back for you." She nodded, and I quickly made my way back up to the first floor, trying not to make any noise. I jumped into a closet in the hallway, hoping I wouldn't be found. The footsteps came closer, and I held my breath. The man entered the house, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't see his face through the gaps in the closet, but he looked big and dangerous. He passed the closet and went down to the basement. After a few seconds, I heard her screams, full of despair and pain. I knew that I could not remain inactive. I came out of my hiding place and started looking for my phone to call the police. But my phone was in the bedroom on the second floor. Each step up seemed like an eternity. When I finally reached my room, I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed 911. "Brockton Police, how can I help you?" answered the operator. "I need help. There's a serial killer in my house. There's a girl in the basement. He's with her now. Please send someone immediately," I whispered, trying not to give away my location. "We are sending a patrol to your address. Stay in touch and try to find a safe place," the operator said. I heard the basement door open again. The man was returning. I quickly hid under the bed, holding my breath. He entered the room and I saw his feet. He stopped, then began to look around the room. I realized that my life now depended on whether I managed to remain unnoticed until the police arrived. I was lying under the bed, trying not to breathe, listening to the steps of the killer, who were getting closer to me. He muttered something under his breath as he looked around the room. I saw his legs moving, searching for something, and my heart was pounding in my chest as if it might explode at any moment. Finally, he stopped at the door, taking a deep breath. I thought he let out a disappointed sigh and then began to slowly make his way back down the stairs. I stayed under the bed for a few more minutes, waiting until I heard the sound of police sirens. Time dragged on for an unbearably long time, but in the end, I heard the long-awaited sound. Police sirens pierced the silence of the night, and I felt some of the tension leave my body. I carefully crawled out from under the bed and rushed to the window to signal the police. When I opened the window, I panicked. The police were still on the road, and the killer could hear them approaching. I quickly ran out of the room and started to go downstairs, but suddenly stopped halfway. The basement was open, and I heard his footsteps quickly approaching the stairs. "They are already here," I thought. "I have to find a safe place." I ran out into the backyard and hid behind the bushes, praying the killer wouldn't see me. Police cars pulled up in front of the house and I heard the officers yelling orders. They entered the house and I heard shots. Everything mixed into one chaotic noise. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the police officers found me. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping me up. "There's a girl in the basement," I said, trying to hold back tears. "He's holding her hostage." The policeman nodded and signaled to his colleagues. They quickly entered the house and found the girl. She was alive but badly injured. She was immediately sent to the hospital. The murderer was arrested, but the feeling of fear did not leave me. I knew that this night would leave its mark on my life forever. I had witnessed true evil, and now I would have to live with that knowledge. After that terrible night, I returned to my house, trying to recover from what I had experienced. The police left him, but the fear remained. Every sound, every shadow made me shudder. I tried to find the strength to trust people again and live a normal life, but it was difficult. One day, a few weeks later, I decided to visit the hospital where the rescued girl was. Her name was Emily, and she looked a little better than when I first saw her. She was grateful that I had saved her, but I knew that she too would never forget what had happened. "How are you?" I asked, sitting next to her bed. "Better," she replied, trying to smile, "but it's still hard to sleep at night." "I know how you feel," I said. "It's hard for me too, but we have to stick together and help each other." Emily nodded, and we started talking about everything that happened. She told me more about the killer, how he kidnapped his victims and kept them in the basement before harming them. I felt chills on my skin listening to these terrible stories. "But you know what's worst?" she continued, looking straight into my eyes. "I was not his first victim, and, I'm afraid, not the last." These words made me think. The killer was arrested, but what if there were others working with him? What if this was just the beginning? I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. I needed to act. I decided I had to find out more about the killer and his possible accomplices. It meant going back to where it all began, the house where I found Emily. I knew it would be dangerous, but there was no other way out. I started my investigation from local archives and newspapers. Brockton had a long history, and I was hoping to find some clues about murders or disappearances that might be related to our case. The archivist, a local old man named Henry, was very helpful. He walked me through the mountains of documents, and we began to search. A few days later, I came across a series of articles that seemed suspicious to me. They talked about the disappearances of young women that had occurred in Brockton over the past 10 years. All these women disappeared without a trace, and no trace or suspect was ever found. This can't be a coincidence, I thought. Something is wrong here. I decided to talk to the families of the missing women to find out more. They might know something that wasn't mentioned in the articles. First on the list was the family of Maria Jenkins, who disappeared 5 years ago. Her parents still lived in the same house, and I went to live with them. Mrs. Jenkins opened the door. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from tears. She invited me inside, and we sat down in the living room. I explained who I was and why I came. "Maria was a beautiful girl," said Mrs. Jenkins, wiping away tears. "She would never leave without warning. We know something happened to her." "Did you notice anything suspicious prior to her disappearance?" I asked. "Yes, there was one thing," she replied, looking thoughtfully out the window. "She said someone was watching her. We thought it was just her imagination, but now I'm not sure." This was an important clue. I realized that the killer or his accomplices could have been watching their victims before abducting them. I needed to know more. I continued my investigations by meeting other families and gathering information. Each new detail confirmed my suspicions. There was a group of assassins operating in Brockton, and they were experienced and very careful. But I decided that I would not stop until I exposed them and put an end to this horror. My determination to expose the killers grew stronger after each conversation with the families of the missing women. Every new detail, every little clue confirmed that there was a group of killers operating in the city. I realized that I had to act carefully so as not to become the next victim. The next step was to seek out those who might know more about the activities of the killers in Brockton. I turned to detectives who worked on cases of missing women. One of them was Detective Jonathan Reed. He was already retired but had extensive experience in the police. I found his address and went to his house. He lived on the outskirts of the city, in a small but cozy house. When I knocked on the door, he appeared almost immediately, looking at me suspiciously. "How can I help?" he asked. "Detective Reed, my name is Jane. I'm investigating the disappearance of young women in Brockton. Maybe you heard about the recent case with Emily? I rescued her, and now I'm trying to find out if there is a connection between these disappearances." He listened carefully to me, then invited me inside. We sat down in the kitchen, and I began to tell him everything I had learned. "You are very brave," he said when I finished. "But you should know that it is extremely dangerous." "I understand, but I can't just sit back," I replied. "I must find them and stop them." He sighed and nodded. "Okay, I'll help you. I have some old files and contacts that might be useful, but promise to be careful." I agreed, and he started sharing information with me. It turned out that there were suspicions about the existence of a secret organization that kidnapped and killed women. They acted carefully, leaving a minimum of traces. "We believe they had informants in town," Detective Reed said. "This may explain why they always knew when the police were approaching. This was an important clue. I realized that I should be especially careful who I trust. I decided to go back to the house where I found Emily and investigate further. Maybe I missed some clues or hints. I returned to the house where I found Emily, feeling anxious again. This place was abandoned, but I knew there might be important clues left here. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were boarded up. I carefully entered inside, looking around. The house looked just as awful as it had in my memory. The basement was still open, and I felt a chill on my skin again. I went downstairs, lighting the way with a flashlight. The basement was dark and damp, and I tried not to focus on the horrible memories. I began scanning the room for any clues that might lead me to the killers. There were various tools on the walls, but nothing suspicious. Then I noticed a small door in the corner that I hadn't noticed before. It was half open, and behind it a staircase could be seen going down. I gathered all my courage and went down the stairs. It was another basement, even deeper and darker. I saw an old table with papers and photos on it. They were terrible. Photographs of women bound and immobilized, their faces full of fear. Emily was among them. I quickly took pictures of the evidence on my phone, trying not to touch anything. I knew it could be important to the police. Then I noticed a list of names on one of the sheets. These were the names of women I already knew and a few more I hadn't heard of. Suddenly, I heard footsteps upstairs. Someone entered the house. My heart froze, and I realized that I had to hide. I turned off the flashlight and lay down under the table, trying to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps were approaching. I heard someone coming down the stairs. My breathing became fast, and I prayed that I wouldn't be found. The killer looked around the room, and I saw his feet very close. He stopped at the table, and I felt sweat form on my forehead. "What are you doing here?" I heard his voice, and I was overcome with horror. My heart stopped when I heard his voice. I was sure that he would find me, but suddenly he retreated. Footsteps began to recede, and I heard him climbing the stairs. It wasn't until I heard the front door close that I finally dared to exhale. I stayed under the table for a few more minutes, trying to calm down. Then, sure that the killer was gone, I got out of hiding and quickly left the basement. I knew I had strong evidence and needed to notify the police immediately. I quickly ran to my car and drove to the police station. All the way, I was afraid that the killer could track me down. When I arrived, I was met by the officer on duty, to whom I immediately showed the photos and the list of names I had found. They quickly called together a team of detectives, and I was invited into the interrogation room, where I told everything I saw and found. Among the detectives was Jonathan Reed. He listened attentively without interrupting. "You did a great job," he said when I finished. "These photos can help us find these people and save other women." The officers immediately went to the house I described. Jonathan stayed with me, and we began to discuss the next steps. He knew that now we had to act quickly to prevent the killers from hiding. The next day, the police organized a large-scale operation to capture the criminals. They collected all possible resources and began raids on possible places of their shelter. I could not sit idly by and decided to help as much as I could. I met Jonathan again. We looked through all the documents we found and tried to find additional clues. The list of names I found was particularly important. He pointed to connections between victims and killers, as well as possible new targets. We discovered that all the women who disappeared were connected to a certain nightclub in the center of the city. It was a popular place for young people, but I would never have thought that it could be associated with such horror. We decided to visit this club to find out more. When we arrived at the club, it was already full of people. The music was playing loudly, and I felt anxious. We started questioning the staff and visitors, but no one noticed anything suspicious. However, one of the barmaids said she saw some of the missing women in the company of men who frequented the club. They always came together, she said, and then I didn't see them again. This was important information. We realized that the killers used the club to find their victims. Jonathan decided to stay and continue the investigation, while I went home to rest and collect my thoughts. When I got home, I felt exhausted. My apartment seemed safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked and tried to get some sleep. Sleep came hard, and I woke up at every sound. In the middle of the night, I heard someone softly knocking on the door. My heart beat faster. I went to the door and asked, "Who is there?" "This is Jonathan," said a familiar voice. I sighed with relief and opened the door. "I thought you might be in danger," he said as he walked inside. "I found something important in the club and I want you to see it." He unfolded a piece of paper with an address on it. "This is a warehouse where they can keep the women. We should go there immediately." I agreed, and we quickly drove to the specified place. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, in a remote area. When we arrived, I felt a strong tension. We cautiously approached the building and heard sounds inside. Jonathan and I decided not to wait for reinforcements and entered on our own. It was dark and quiet inside, but we could hear muffled voices. I was ready for any turn of events. We carefully moved through the dark corridors of the warehouse, lighting the way with flashlights. The sounds were getting louder, and we realized that we were getting closer to the source. My heart was beating wildly, and there was a lump in my throat. Every step was difficult, but I knew we had to go on. Finally, we reached the large room where the voices were coming from. We looked inside and saw several men standing by a table discussing something. Behind them, we saw the cages in which the women were locked. Their faces were pale and frightened. "We must act quickly," Jonathan whispered. "I'll try to divert their attention and you free the women." I nodded, realizing that there was no time to think. Jonathan entered the room, attracting the attention of the men. I quickly made my way to the cages and started looking for the keys. Finding them, I began to unlock the locks, freeing the women one by one. One of the men noticed me and started shouting. I realized that we had little time and hurried to free the last woman. At that moment, Jonathan collided with the man, trying to buy us a few seconds. "Run!" I shouted to the women, and they rushed to the exit. I came back to help Jonathan. We struggled together with the men, trying to hold on. Suddenly, one of them took out a knife and rushed at me. I backed away, but he grabbed my arm. The pain was unbearable, but I gathered all my strength and pushed him away. At this time, Jonathan neutralized another attacker. We broke out of the building and saw that reinforcements had already arrived. The police surrounded the warehouse, detaining all the suspects. The women were saved, and I felt relieved, even though I knew this was just the beginning of the fight. After that night, events began to unfold rapidly. The police arrested several suspects, but we knew that this was only the tip of the iceberg. Jonathan and I continued to investigate, trying to find everyone involved in this network. We discovered that the organization had deep roots in the city and had been active for many years. Each new fact only strengthened our desire to bring the matter to an end. The women we rescued were willing to help by testifying and sharing their experiences. Jonathan invited me to his apartment to discuss the next steps. We sat at the table looking at the collected documents and planning our actions. I felt that we were on the right path, but at the same time, I knew that danger still loomed over us. "We have to be careful," Jonathan said as we discussed the plan. "This organization has influential friends, and they can strike at us at any moment." "I understand," I answered. "But we have to stop them. They cannot go unpunished." We worked through the night preparing for the next phase of the investigation. As dawn peeked through the windows, I felt tired but also determined. I knew I wasn't going to stop until I got the job done. The next day, we went to see one of the suspects, who was the owner of a nightclub. We knew he could be a key figure in the organization, and we intended to get as much information from him as possible. We arrived at his house early in the morning. It was a large, luxurious mansion surrounded by a high fence. Jonathan knocked on the door, and we waited for it to be opened. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man appeared, dressed in an expensive suit. "How can I help?" he asked, looking at us suspiciously. "We want to talk to you about your club's activities," Jonathan said. "We have some questions you could answer." The man reluctantly invited us inside. We sat down in the living room, and I felt the tension rise. Jonathan began asking questions about his connections with the suspects and the activities of the club. The man refused to answer at first, but then he realized that we know more than we think. "Okay," he finally said. "I will tell you everything I know, but you must promise to protect me." We agreed, and he began to tell. It turned out that the club was just a front for their activities. They kidnapped women who came there and sold them into slavery. He gave us the names of other members of the organization and the addresses of their hiding places. This information was extremely valuable. We thanked him and immediately left for the police to hand over all the evidence we had collected. Jonathan knew that we now had enough information to launch a massive operation against this organization. The police immediately launched an operation to arrest the suspects at the addresses we provided. It was a large-scale operation that required the coordination of many units. Jonathan and I were at the center of events, following the development of the situation. I could not get rid of the anxious feeling. Are we missing something important? Will we have time to save everyone who is being held captive? These thoughts did not give me peace, but I knew that we must continue the fight. The first objects were captured without any particular problems. Police broke into houses and warehouses, detaining suspects and freeing victims. However, one of the addresses turned out to be empty, which made us nervous. "They could have learned about our plans," Jonathan said. "We must be ready for any development of events." Finally, we reached the last object, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This was the place where, according to our informant, the most women were kept. When we arrived, we were met by armed men guarding the building. The police surrounded the warehouse, preparing for an assault. Jonathan and I also joined in, ready to help. The sound of gunshots and screams filled the air as we stormed inside. It was clear that this place was a real stronghold of criminals. Chaos reigned inside the warehouse. The police and the guards of the criminals fought for every meter of space. I saw some of our men fall, wounded or killed. It was hell on earth, but we couldn't back down. Jonathan and I made our way forward, looking for women. In the dark corners of the warehouse, we found locked rooms where they were kept. Their faces were pale and scared, but there was also hope in their eyes. "We came to save you," I said, opening one of the doors. Women rushed to us, crying and thanking. We took them outside, where they were met by doctors and policemen. The battle continued for some time, but in the end we were able to capture the warehouse. All criminals were either detained or destroyed. It was a great victory, but I knew the fight was not over. After the operation, we returned to the police station where all the participants gathered. I saw the tired but satisfied faces of the policemen and doctors. We knew that we had saved many lives, but we also knew that there was still a lot of work to be done. The police chief thanked us for our work and noted that we had taken an important step in the fight against this organization. Jonathan and I received official thanks, but the greatest reward for us was seeing the rescued women who were now able to return to their families. After the meeting, Jonathan and I decided to rest for a while. We went to a coffee shop nearby and ordered coffee. Sitting around the table, we discussed our next steps. "It was hard, but we did it," Jonathan said, smiling. "We saved many lives today." "Yes," I answered, feeling relieved. "But we must continue. This organization is not destroyed yet, and we must find everyone involved." We spent the next few days analyzing the collected information and planning further actions. The police arrested many suspects, and we hoped they would provide new evidence to help us expand our investigation. One evening, when we were getting ready to finish our work, one of the detectives approached us. He had a worried look on his face. "You should see this," he said, handing us a folder of documents. We opened it and saw pictures taken at the club where it all started. One of them depicted a man whom we did not recognize. "Who is this?" I asked, looking at the detective. "This is one of the leaders of the organization," he answered. "We found these photos on the computer of one of the suspects. He works under different names and has always evaded arrest. We realized that we had a real enemy in front of us and decided to immediately start the search. He was the most dangerous and cunning of all that we had pursued, and we knew that we were in for a serious fight. Our new enemy was cunning and dangerous. We began to gather information about his past and learned that he used several different names and lived a lavish lifestyle, hiding his true intentions. His real name was Michael Raines. Jonathan and I decided to act quickly. After gathering all possible information about his whereabouts, we set out for his last known address. It was a huge, luxurious villa on the outskirts of the city. When we arrived, we were greeted by closed gates and security. We introduced ourselves and said we had a search warrant. The guards reluctantly let us in. It was quiet and peaceful inside the villa, like a trap waiting for its victims. We split up, searching each room for Michael. I was studying the spacious living room when I heard a noise from the next room. There was Jonathan, who found the hidden entrance to the basement. We went down there carefully, knowing that Michael might be armed. The basement was dark and damp, like a labyrinth with many rooms and corridors. We moved forward, relying on the weak light of the lanterns. Time seemed to drag on forever as we searched for our enemy. Suddenly, we heard screams. We ran to the sound and found the room where Michael was holding the women captive. They were tied up and scared. We immediately cut their ropes and set them free. "Michael is here somewhere," said one of the women, trembling with fear. "He said he wouldn't let us escape." We knew we had to act fast. We brought the women to the surface, where they were met by the police and medics. Then they went back to the basement to find Michael. We finally found him deep in the basement in a room that had been set up as his personal retreat. Michael sat at the table, smiling. "Do you think you won?" he said without getting up. "You are just pawns in my game." "Game over, Michael," I replied. "You are under arrest." He suddenly jumped out with his gun drawn, but Jonathan was faster. A shot rang out and Michael fell, wounded but alive. We immediately handcuffed him and brought him to the surface. This day was a victory for us, but I knew that our journey was not over yet. We saved many women and apprehended a dangerous criminal, but the organization he led still existed. I looked at Jonathan, who was standing next to me, tired but satisfied. We took a big step forward, and I knew that together we could continue this fight. "This is just the beginning," I said, looking at the sunset. "We will continue." Jonathan nodded, and we went back to work preparing for new challenges and victories.